Welcome to the Capability Cafe webinar on using Agile methods for HR and learning projects. A couple of housekeeping rules before we begin. This session is being recorded for replay later. We also have a Twitter back channel, and the hashtag to be used for this session is hash hashtag is Agile for HR. So if you want to jump on Twitter and tweet what's happening on the webinar, that'll be good. Apart from myself, we also have Aaron Tooth, who is an extremely experienced and highly credentialed agile practitioner. Aaron has some impressive certifications and experience from some of the prominent organizations in Australia, including Westpac. We hope this webinar is going to be a good one because we actually had a record number of registrations, 210 plus from 100 different organizations. So looking forward to your participation in the discussions and the QA. Just a quick slide on the takeaways for this session before we begin to really set the scene. The first one really is the use of agile methods is still nascent in HR. It's growing, but it's still nascent. In fact, in one of the recent reports um, released on the state of Scrum, after finance, HR was about 18%. So it was really second last in the list of functions that used agile, finance being at the bottom. But in HR itself, learning has made a bit more progress in the sense because they do develop online courses that has been used. Agile has been used for development of online courses. Secondly, there are a lot of agile methods to choose from, but and we'll be mentioning some Scrum, Kanban. There's also extreme programming and a whole host of other methods. But really, what we're saying here is that they kind of operate on similar principles. So we are talking about all the agile methods under this umbrella term. The one thing that we've kind of realized is that agile is not appropriate for all kind of projects, right? There are some projects that are more appropriate than the others. So really, one has to resist the need to let's agile everything directive from the top management and just choose the projects that really work with agile. The reality also is that agile does struggle in top-down bureaucratic organizations because it is a very empowering um, practice, which where the power resides with the team, and really there's complete trust in the team to plan to deliver the results that are required without too much managerial intervention, which can be a challenge to a lot of managers in organizations. Agile is a proper profession with a defined career path, so superficial exposure is not enough. You really kind of need to get the certifications and experience to call yourself an agile professional. And I do hope that some of you will choose this career path because it is quite exciting. The most important thing, though, is that Agile is the right operating system for the future of work as it has been predicted. One where the work of knowledge workers is distributed throughout the organization. Expertise is recognized and rewarded, and really for that kind of an organization, top-down doesn't work, and Agile probably is the best operating system for that. Quick slide on Learning Cafe. If you haven't been on a Learning Cafe webinar before, Learning Cafe and Capability Cafe are communities of professionals interested in learning and capability.
It's actually more that we prioritize the most risky things first in order to mitigate them. Something really worthwhile to discuss here is that the little note there below. So while there is value in items on the right, we value the items on the left more. So in Agile, it's a common thing where people might assume, we don't like doing documentation, and that's not actually true. So it's doing the appropriate amount of documentation rather than writing essays and theses when it's a simple change to a product or a minor update to a process. It's about doing what's actually needed and not sort of adhering to processes that were around in a different time. So with that in mind, just wanted to look at Scrum as a whole. So this is a small diagram of Scrum, which is, to my knowledge at least, it's probably one of the oldest agile processes or tools that are used. Um, so basically, Scrum has a fairly simple design, and that's why it can be applied to a wide range of situations. You start with a product backlog, which is refined and iterated on with a team, and then moving into your sprint planning. So for sprint planning, just for context, in Scrum, we iterate in sprints, which, depending on your company and who you're working with and the nature of the work, generally tend to go between 1 week to 4 weeks. Uh, the key is, though, when you're talking about a sprint and committing to a plan, that you actually keep the length of them consistent. So what you want to avoid is going from, doing 1 week sprint during one iteration and then the next one just changing it to 3 weeks and then changing it back to 2 weeks. While it's important to find the right level, you want to try and maintain consistency, because over time that allows the team to demonstrate that capacity within a sprint and inherently gives you more predictability when you're having changing requirements or adjustments in the work. So during sprint planning, that's where the team will agree on what they're able to deliver, and they'll actually be able to start pulling apart the various tasks and making sure that they've estimated them properly. So the idea is that for that 2 week period, you'll be able to commit to an amount of work, and you'll actually be able to have it actually completed and finished at the end of the sprint. But in 2 weeks, a lot can happen, right? So that's why we have the daily scrum. And in the daily scrum, that's where the team has an opportunity to meet and convene and raise anything that might be impeding their efforts within the sprint, or potentially synchronize, see how they can best support each other, and generally just make sure that they maintain synchronous throughout the course of the sprint. Then when we get to the other end, we've got the sprint review. So the sprint review performs two major functions. One, it allows the product owner, who we'll talk about in the next slide, to present with the team the outputs of the sprint to the stakeholders or whomever is interested in the work the team is doing. And then there's the second part, which is being able to understand any feedback or iterations that need to come. So if we're talking about developing a new product or putting any piece of work together, this is where the stakeholders get an opportunity to provide feedback and say, okay, well, I like that, but I think it should be blue. So that's where we can then work in new changes that can be brought into the following sprint if required. And off the back of the sprint review, we have the retrospective. So the retrospective is where we actually inspect our own performance. So how well did we work together as a team? Is there better things we could have done to actually improve our situation? What's making us slow down? What's impeding us? And it's really a chance for the team to reflect and look at what they did well, so we don't lose that in the next sprint, and look at what wasn't performed ideally so we can fix that for the next sprint. And it's that game of inches. So the idea is that, sure, you might have your very first sprint ever as a team, and that might have some difficulties. Then you have a retrospective at the end, you have your sprint review, so you've got stakeholder feedback. The team's had a chance to reflect and understand where they could improve, and then you iterate. So the idea is progressively over time, each sprint, the team gets a little bit better at what they're doing.
So, Aaron, can I just kind of interrupt you just to ask a few questions, because for those who are not familiar with sprints,
Yeah,
this kind of usually means that the team is really just dedicated to this one project, right? This one, right? And they usually don't kind of split duties. They're kind of really focused intensely on this one project. That's how it works, right?
well, I guess as a general rule, they're dedicated to the work of the product backlog. So a product backlog could consist of work from multiple projects, but where you'd want to be sort of conscious of, right, is you don't want to start introducing work that is completely alien to the team. Or if you do, you want to make sure that you're allowing enough time, which will probably end up being multiple sprints, for them to be able to come up to speed. So ultimately, you can feed any work that the team have the skills for into the product backlog, but it comes back down to what the product owner sees value in working on. And it actually links in quite nicely with this slide. So the product owner, since we're sort of on the topic, the product owner is the person that essentially determines what's valuable and what should belong in the backlog. So that might come in the form of negotiating with stakeholders and discussing what features need to come in there, and just understanding and fine-tuning the needs of the people in the organization or the customers. Or it could also be that they want to focus on operational improvements. So, a lot of Agile folks and people in the IT world are really passionate about DevOps at the moment. A product owner might do so much as dedicating an entire sprint to improving a team's DevOps practices, so following sprints they can get more done. So, and that's where there's that difference there. So it's not necessarily a sole project, while that can be a good approach, and that's one that I've seen quite commonly. But ultimately, whatever the product deems as valuable is sort of what ends up in that backlog, and inherently ends up in the sprint planning, and then the team work to deliver to it. So on that note, I'll just do a quick round of the other roles we have here. So the other one's the actual development team themselves. So a quick call out here, if we look at the most recent version of the Scrum Guide, development team isn't specifically intended as software developers. It's intended as people that need to work on complex stuff, basically. So it's not like, this is something that's sort of started becoming an evolution within the world of Scrum. They've started moving away from a situation where they focus solely on software. So the idea is that Scrum is, or at least the intent for those who authored the Scrum Guide, it's that it's used to solve complex problems. And that's essentially the development team within the sprint. That's them being able to focus and concentrate on the work in itself without having outside distractions. And then we move over to the Scrum Master. So the Scrum Master is the one who's responsible for protecting the team from those distractions. They also focus on coaching. So I've heard a lot of people previously trying to explain a Scrum Master by saying they're a project manager, but, and ... insert an explanation there. When in actual fact, it's much more accurate to pose a Scrum Master as a coach that has an affinity for coordination. Like, yes, there's an implicit degree of trying to make sure that the team understand how to stay organized, but they do so from a perspective of coaching them to get better at organizing themselves rather than actually managing that work. So it creates a really different dynamic around how this group operates and how they have a relationship with the business. And I often find that when we go back to that comment mentioned at the start during the introduction around those hierarchies, right? So when we're talking about hierarchies, it can sometimes become a bit muddied for a stakeholder, like who are they meant to speak to for an issue that they have. Most often that tends to become a split between the Scrum Master and the product owner, but ideally they should be working hand in hand to make sure that the business appropriately getting what they need and understanding the right flows of information, while at the same time making sure that the development team aren't receiving distractions directly from the business when they're trying to work on their deliverables and make sure that the right outcomes are being achieved.
Aaron, there's a question from Steph asking for a real life example where the Scrum Master actually helps people avoid distractions.
Yeah, certainly. So I can even sort of provide one from the past few days, actually. So we had a situation where a stakeholder was quite apprehensive about a particular update, and they engaged one of the team members directly. For that team member to basically provide that update, it was going to require some investigation, and it would require quite a bit of work to craft an appropriate response. So I became aware of it, and I quite literally just got the information on behalf of the team member and then went and had the conversation with the stakeholder for them. I ended up losing about an hour and a half of time, but it's much more valuable for that to be me doing that rather than that team member, spending that time when they could be working. And that's quite literally happened this week. And you find quite often for Scrum Masters, it's imperative that they stay close to their teams and understand their pain, because otherwise you're not going to have that visibility to be able to step in that manner. Were there any other questions on that point, Jeevan?
All good.
Okay, fantastic. And no, they're not blocking people's Facebook accounts. Sorry, Steph. That's not necessarily a Scrum Master thing. Okay, so I just also wanted to take some time to cover off on some other Agile tools or common things that we tend to use. So being HR themed, I decided to try and be a bit cheeky and frame this in the context of dealing with a recruitment flow. So this is what we'd commonly refer to as a Kanban board. Now, this isn't necessarily the most scientific of them, but essentially the idea is that you break down your flow of work that the team regularly does. So with any process or any work that people often experience, there's always going to be high level phases or sequences. And even if you start with to do, in progress, and done, that's something that you start with and then you evolve from it as you learn to understand. So the idea here is that we can clearly see for each of the flows. So in the to do column, we've got role 6, and that's fine. There's currently 2 interviews in progress. 2 roles have reference checks being done on them. 2 are negotiating contract, and 1 is done. Now, one of the reasons why we use this, and we typically try to use this in a visual sense, and the reason for that is so people are fully aware of where the pressure points are in the team. So if we were to say reference checks had 5 roles in them, and all the other columns had 2, then clearly we understand that there's a influx of reference checks and that they're actually taking some time to get through. And in the world of Kanban, because Kanban actually isn't strictly an agile toolkit, it actually comes from a lean background with Toyota manufacturing. So the idea is that you actually identify, so what's the maximum appropriate amount of items to have in any particular column? So say if you've got 5 in reference checks, you might identify that, okay, well, that's actually slowing down the overall progress of our flow from the left to the right. So maybe we need to put in a work in progress limit on the reference checks and make sure that people are just picking them up when they've actually got capacity to do them, rather than trying to get them all done at once and stumbling and tripping over themselves. So that's the idea of Kanban, and you can actually even go another layer deeper on this, right? So if you're talking to someone that's a very heavy Kanban practitioner, they might have WIP limits on, and sorry, just in case I didn't specify, when I'm saying WIP, I mean work in progress limits, on each of the columns, and those might be varying amounts, and you might even have sub phases within the columns. So you can actually start getting really precise, and as you do that, you can identify the areas for improvement and where to focus on to speed up how many tickets you can get through in a period of time. And now we'll step over to Sociocracy 3.0. So, and this is what Jeevan was he referenced earlier in the introduction. So with Sociocracy 3.0, and I'm just going to refer to it as S3 because phonetically it's a bit of a challenge to say that frequently. S3 is a very large toolkit. So we're actually looking at a single pattern from S3, specifically the one around peer review for roles. So just before I dive into why I'm presenting this one specifically, S3, this is one of about 75 patterns, and all of these are patterns which are tried and tested in agile environments and use different methods for trying to alleviate the issues that you have with collaboration. And also it helps a lot, I've found personally, with if you've got a Scrum team and there's tension between them and the broader organization, a lot of S3 patterns can be used to actually alleviate that tension and ensure that the right flows of communication are occurring to basically make sure everyone's successful, which is usually a fairly strong selling point. So what we're looking at here is the peer review pattern from S3. Now, the idea is that in the world of Agile, you'll quite often find in an adoption that a lot of people will end up having new roles made for them that aren't necessarily their job description. So, particularly in your earlier stages of adoption, a person from the team might become the Scrum Master, or someone that's from the business might become the product owner in the context of the Scrum team. And then if you go and Google product owner job descriptions or try and find some way to match that up, you'll find that there'll be a range of different opinions on what that role entails. And where I've used this is to make sure that where people are filling these roles, that they actually are doing the right thing for the nature of the context. So I'll just step through the various elements involved in doing this. So inviting the contributors, typically that's done by the reviewee, and that's done from the perspective of making sure that they've got a healthy cross-section of all the stakeholders who are impacted by their work. So in this context, let's pretend the reviewee is actually a Scrum Master. So, and I'll actually use myself as an example. So in a previous team, there was some lack of clarity around what a Scrum Master is meant to do and how they best service the team. So I actually kicked off this situation for myself. I invited two people from the team that had vastly different skill sets and sort of impacted the development cycle in different ways. I also invited someone from the business who wasn't strictly related to the project at all, but they did care about the outcome. And I also invited various people from other teams who we either relied on or they relied on us. So presented that. I also gave them a brief summary. It was just a few dot points at the time, just discussing, here's what I'm doing and here's how I'm trying to best service the team. And then we kicked off a half-hour session, I think it was. So in that half-hour session, first each of the contributors presented their appreciation, so essentially what they think I did well. And then we collected those up and gathered all the key points, just basically jotting them down and making sure that they're in a succinct summary so I remember not to forget those essentially. And then we collected some improvement suggestions. And what I found was there were some very key and critical elements of my role that I just hadn't been doing. They were much more governance-based and things around funding and things like that, which traditionally aren't necessarily explicit Scrum Master tasks. But the team and some of the stakeholders actually felt that I would be the person best placed to support that. So then we co-created a development plan around how I would fill that gap without compromising the things that I was doing well. And then we consented to a plan at the end of it. So we eventually sort of iterated on that a few times because when you consent to that plan, you want to have a subsequent review point, right? Something where you can determine that, that's the right thing for the situation and, the context might change over time and you start to iterate and adjust your own role description of a sort. And this pattern in particular, like among many others, is one that I think if you're looking at adopting Agile, particularly if it's in uncertain circumstances, this is a really effective way to do that. Okay, so Jeevan, I believe that brings us over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. So, Aaron, thanks a lot. And I know, now listen, the reason why I was very keen for Aaron to share sociocracy is really, as a HR professional, and especially if you're interested in organizational design and at the organization level, it is a philosophy and a way of working that, that kind of changes the very DNA of the organization and makes all those things that we hear about, collaboration and empowerment. So it's a very practical operating system, for that. But what I want to do is kind of share some of the statistics from the latest State of the Scrum Report 2017-2018. And there's some really telling statistics, and it's actually thanks to Aaron because he posted it on LinkedIn yesterday, I think the day before yesterday or yesterday, and that's how I came to know of the report. But essentially, it is a report based on a survey of 2,000 plus Scrum aligned members, like myself. Of course, I didn't respond, but from 91 countries, and as you can see from the primary functional area, mostly it's IT software development,
and very little L&D. Probably education 1% at the bottom would include L&D. So it's really a Scrum view. Now, the the stats you might be interested is that 94% of the responded said they use Scrum in their agile practice. So Scrum is a pretty major component or major method for agile. But 78% actually use it in combination with others. So there was a question about design thinking, and Aaron talked about Kanban, extreme programming. So there's actually, and even waterfall to an extent. So Scrum is actually blended with other approaches depending upon what fits into the organization and the project. 16% use Scrum exclusively, and I know that within the Scrum community there is a big focus on the pure discipline of using Scrum or using pure Scrum, right? But the reality is a little bit different. The average team size for Scrum is 7.4, and I think I guess a minimum would be 5, maybe 4, but anything less than that becomes a little bit more challenging because I guess there's not enough collaboration, um, opportunities to collaborate. The number of sprints, which is the number of iteration per project, is 5. So they kind of go through 5 cycles before they finish on an average. And the average duration of a Scrum project is around 11.6 or 12 weeks, right? So they're kind of 2 into 6, 12 weeks. That's kind of the statistics behind sprint. 63% of the projects are deemed a success, and that I don't have statistics from the waterfall approach, but that's very much higher than waterfall projects. What is really important for all HR and especially learning professionals is that 81% hold a retrospective after each sprint. So retrospective is essentially once you've completed a sprint, is a stand back and assess and brief what has gone good, what has gone wrong, what can be done better, and then incorporate as much of those learnings into the next sprint, which essentially kind of starts next week or the next day, right? So that learning and improvement is embedded in Scrum, and I really kind of like that aspect of Scrum because every week you're increasing level of performance. 87% have a daily Scrum mate, so that is quite impressive given that in the work we normally do in traditional functions, it's a weekly meeting, right? But here you're kind of basically planning out what needs to be done and who will do it, and if they need any help every day, right? So there are shades of the ideal performance management embedded into Scrum/Agile. 91% of the organizations offer training and coaching, and this is quite important because it is there are some, it's got very specific principles and ways of working. So um, it certainly is an important component, and this is where HR professionals come in, is just making sure that an organization which wants to go agile has enough training and coaching. I'm going to give it back to Aaron for the next part. I don't know, what do you?
Thanks a lot, Jeevan. So basically, this is a quick case study. And it's a bit of a odd situation. So this is where we've actually had someone in the Agile community who's applied the ideas of Scrum to a completely different context, something that isn't even related to projects. So this is actually regarding ING in the Netherlands. They were processing loans, I believe it was mortgages, to the best of my recollection. But essentially what we're looking at here, so here's a map of the Netherlands. So we've actually got 3 points of contact in the country. So if you were like back when this first kicked off, I believe it was about 4 or 5 years ago, if you had an application, it would bounce between these 3 sites for the various elements, like taking the initial application, having the underwriting assessed, and all of the teams actually supporting the software that enabled the application to go through without an issue, were all over in a different area entirely. So you've got a distributed team trying to resolve one issue for a customer, and it had lengthy time periods for them to try and work through any issues. And at this point in time, ING were really trying to advance themselves in that space. and they were trying to sort of remain competitive, and they were finding it difficult because they had a lot of challenges, both operationally and from a technology perspective. So this is a good call out on how you can actually apply the idea of a cross-functional team and ensuring collaboration. So when they started, this is a list of some of the roles. There were actually more, but these were the key roles that would be involved in your mortgage application. So as you can see, there's quite a number of roles. It's possible that your application would be influenced or impacted by every one of these people, and sometimes multiple people within roles. What they transitioned to was a situation where they had cross-functional teams that had mix of people who dealt directly with the customers and people that supported the technology that allowed the applications to occur. And this really goes to show how broad the application of these ideas can be. So it's not just for projects. You can even extend the concept out to operational situations, and it creates value for people. And on the note of the structure, here's where they landed. So each of these CLT groups are a team. So a mix of people who developed applications for the business to actually service the customers, and people who actually answered phones and did underwriting and those kind of activities to allow the mortgage to go through. And then each team had an agile coach. So agile coaches, as we know them, are typically people who are introduced on a consultative basis or on a permanent basis, and they'll stay around and coach you into an agile situation. In this context, that's actually not strictly true. While it was still fundamentally a coaching role, these weren't people who were entirely just a group of agile professionals. Many of them were actually the former managers. So what they did was they actually changed the context of that management. So it's like you're no longer someone necessarily responsible for purely like managing tasks and things like that, because suddenly you had a situation where someone who was a manager for a call center was now responsible for a team where people were doing software development. Like that kind of transition, you can't hope for a single person to fully appreciate all the different skills at play there, particularly overnight. So they were then shifted to this agile coach role, where they were encouraged to ensure the team had what they needed to be able to support themselves. And where they actually found a lot of benefit in doing that is, rather than trying to take out the middle management layer and the people who, had an intimate understanding of the organization, the bureaucracy, they actually changed the context and re-incentivized them around making sure operational improvement and making sure people were happy and engaged were like that became that quota rather than performance. The team still owned performance, but that was okay because they had the support to take ownership of it. And then you've got the circle lead. So the idea of these circles, and this is actually probably a closer idea to Sociocracy 3.0 rather than Scrum, but the idea of these circles is that you actually, you've got your coaches that move around supporting the CLTs as needed, but then you'd have a circle lead, and that person was a leader for a domain. So if someone in a CLT or one of the coaches themselves had an issue, then the circle lead would ensure that the circle would get together and they'd actually see if the collective intelligence would be able to arrive at a solution or some way to support that person or the team or resolve whatever issue might occur. And then we've got the super circle lead. So again, talking about the super circle, where this is ranging across large, broad groups of people. But again, the same principle applies. Each subgroup, so each circle lead or a circle lead plus one, someone that's close to the knowledge, actually go and meet on a regular basis to make sure that there's synchronization across departments and organizations. And this concept, while it might seem reasonably simple, the effects of it can be quite powerful. I mean, we'll get to some of the other frameworks later, but most agile frameworks that are designed to operate at scale have some kind of answer to these problems that are similar to this. And here we go about the frameworks and practitioners. So there was a lot of questions that people raised prior to the session around certification and interest in becoming a practitioner. So each of these are various organizations that are known to offer certifications. There are others around, but by far the vast majority will come back to these. So the Scrum Alliance is the oldest of them, essentially. That was one of the first organizations to offer any kind of certification or training in Scrum. They've also got a lengthy progression path where you can sort of go on and explore Scrum more than just the baseline, becoming a certified Scrum Master. Scrum.org essentially is the same as Scrum Alliance for all intents and purposes. However, they've got a slightly different philosophy on how they train and a few of the elements on the roles. So both of them have similar offerings, but just different approaches on how they deliver it to you. The other two I'll touch on, which are quite similar in some respects, or three actually. So you've got Enterprise Scrum, Large Scale Scrum, which is less, and Scaled Agile Framework Enterprise, which is safe. So each of these have their own framework or guidance as to how you can operate Agile on a larger scale. There is usually quite a bit of debate in the Agile community over which is best and which is the most appropriate. To be entirely honest, my opinion is that they're all different toolkits and each of them can offer different things for different contexts. And quite often, even in a context of a scaled setting, I find that no one of them has the right answer for every situation. You're usually pulling influence from others, but each of them have their own training and certifications that can be worth a look. And the other one is IC Agile. So IC Agile tends to be a bit of an outlier. So they don't strictly train and operate in the same way that the others do. Their courses are very heavily workshop orientated, and they step outside of just frameworks and methodologies. They've actually got things that are quite practical in terms of how do you actually coach people, and how do you do that with using agile jargon essentially. So whereas if you look at the other ones, most of their equivalent certifications aren't actually around training you to do that. It's around you getting certified as someone who's recognized to do that. So IC Agile can provide a lot of guidance if there's something where you just don't have the understanding and you want to explore it more. So that's just a bit of an overview about practitioners. If anyone does have any interest or questions on it, I've had some kind of connection with just about all of these organizations at one point or another, so I'm happy to field offline questions and dive into it deeper if you're interested. And that's back over to you, Jeevan.
Thank you, Aaron. That was a good overview of the career paths, and obviously there's lots. We could run a couple of webinars just on the career paths and different options, which we might do a little bit later. But let's get into the specifics of applying HR to HR and learning. So from the 200 people who responded to the survey, the results were that only 10% of us, HR and professionals, had some real intimate experience of agile methods. So only 1%, less than 1% actually had some kind of a certification, and 9% have been intimately involved. More 38% have been kind of involved in agile projects, either directly or on the edges, and 50% have no exposure to agile. So look, it's a great point to start a journey, because we can kind of go all the way, but that's the exposure to agile. 82% of you felt that agile methods need to be adapted or modified to HR and LLD projects, which is, I guess it resonates with the Scrum State of Scrum report, where about, I think it was 78% blend the approach. So kind of that resonates with the other surveys. 1% did say it can't be used for HR, and that's probably the only 1% that I disagree with. And lack of training and managers know-how are the biggest barriers for using Agile in HR and L&D. So I think 44% said managers want Agile but don't know what it is. And I think that's a case which is quite common across organizations. There's this buzzword about Agile or a top-down directive that everything needs to be done via Agile, and nobody quite knows what it involves or how it needs to be done. 3% said the projects are not suited for Agile, which there is a truth, and I'll come to a slide a little bit later. 52% said there was a lack of Agile training. So I think that again got reflected in the other report, where training is and kind of knowing the Agile philosophy and process is quite important, because it is quite specific in some cases. Not specific, but quite different from the traditional way of working. Asked a question about interest in joining the community. 17% did not respond at all, but of those who responded, 62% said yes, and 20% said no. So I'm hoping that we'll have a good sign up for the Agile for HR community. The link is down there in the reference links. So what I'm really impressed with Agile, I want to share this slide with you, is HR professionals and learning professionals. And somebody who's been involved in HR for a long time, close to 25 years now, I really do like Agile, because it's actually got some of the, the idealistic HR concepts embedded within the way it works. So it is so embedded that it can't work without it, and it's structured, right? So the whole thing has been designed by these, 10 software engineers who collected, hotel in the US, and essentially they kind of designed it so that it could, work within siloed bureaucratic organizations. So what you can see, and this is what Aaron talked about, is that there are very clear KPIs. You kind of KPIs, or you kind of know what you're doing and what will be produced by the end of 2 weeks, right, or 1 week, as long as the sprint cycle is. And really, everything is done with the involvement of the entire team, including planning. And the one thing I learned about planning in Scrum is that it's a team that decides how much time it will take to do things, right? So they have a big say, right? So it's not a directive which says, you need to do this 10 tasks, by next week. It's the team decides the sizing, and so they have a lot of control about, what they do. Right, and there are mechanisms in Scrum to ensure that the estimation is done right. I mean, you might get it wrong the first time, where you kind of estimate more time than you actually require, but that gets corrected over time, right? But the important thing is that it's the owner, the tasks and when it will be done and how it will be done is actually completely owned by the team, right? The role of the Scrum Master is quite interesting and a little bit disconcerting for a project manager like myself, who's kind of trying to control everything, is one of a coach. So this is something that I've personally struggled a little bit, is to kind of take a back seat and really trust the team to make the right decisions, and that can be challenging. But I think more importantly, the other thing I realized was that how do you get a high performing team is by actually recruiting the right team in the first place, right? And then embedding this learning process so that the team members collaborate and learn from each other. So there's any information gap or skill gap that actually gets plugged in with the more experienced people helping the less experienced, right? So it's kind of embedded within the team. So the role of the Scrum Master is one that I found really interesting. The team itself is high performing and it's empowered. There are daily feedback comms built into that. So there's your performance appraisal done every 6 months or 1 year. Here we're kind of talking pretty much every day. Right? I did like the fact that sprint retrospective is part of the structure, where after every sprint, the whole team gets together and talks about what went right, what went wrong, and how to improve and how to make things better. So as you can see, as an HR professional, these are actually quite embedded within Agile and Scrum. So if you can get Agile working in the whole organization, your task becomes a lot easier, right? And I think everybody's going to be a lot more happier. So there was one question about where do you apply waterfall and where do you do Agile, and we did mention that Agile is not right for everything, right? So this is one of the graphs that by it's called the Stacy graph, because Stacy developed that. Essentially, what it's kind of done is you've got two axes. Number one is the requirements and the technology. So it doesn't mean software technology. It could be just any technology that's used to produce the product. So if the requirements everybody agrees, and the output and the environment which you're working on is pretty stable, right? That complex is called simple, right? And that is where waterfall works pretty well. It works actually very, very well, because waterfall in reality is a very, very efficient process, right? So you can gain a lot of efficiencies in this very structured and controlled environment. But as we know, in organizations, there is a lot of uncertainty. So, there's a lot of nobody quite agrees on the requirements, or the technology keeps changing. So there is uncertainty. Now that's where Agile actually comes into play, because Agile as a method and a philosophy actually welcomes change and accommodates change. Right? Waterfall is the other one. Is like, these are the specifications and change requests and all that. So Agile actually designed to accommodate change, knowing that requirements in the technology might change. Right. So wherever it is complicated and complex, the agile is well. So if it is simple, try not to do agile, because that's just not the right way to do that. So I'm just wondering, Aaron, do you have any thoughts on this aspect?
Yeah, I do. I think on the upper end of your slide where you've got anarchy, um, there have been experiences. Now, it's not to say that it's ever a simple task, but if you are in a point where any kind of development is complete anarchy, I'd actually still say that using things like agile toolkits, as long as it's the appropriate one and it has the required support, quite often we've seen, and there's been a number of books on like Scrum doing twice the work in half the time by Jeff Sutherland, and also the Phoenix Project explore this in intimate detail. But in those points of anarchy, with the right support, usually you can actually salvage something of value if you're using the toolkits appropriately.
Thank you, Aaron. So let's quickly move an example where the two approaches, waterfall and agile, have been blended, and this is for learning, development of learning solutions. So what they're doing is they're actually doing ADDIE. That's the whole sequence, but they're doing it many times. So they have actually kind of compressed the waterfall into 4 different cycles, and it's, I think, an example from Suncorp. So there are ways of blending the two approaches to get the result that suits the culture. So I think we're running short of time, but just a few ideas about how Agile can be applied to HR. Right. So, for example, in recruitment acquisition, you could use the Agile approach to developing job descriptions for new roles. So this is where nobody quite knows what the person will be doing and what skills they require. Right. So the end product could be a job description, or indeed designing recruitment campaigns can be developed in sprints, right? So you're either tackling a new job market, or it's a new role, or so definitely wherever there is a little bit uncertainty, um, and the requirements keep changing. So that's one example of acquisition. Business partnership, I think this might work really well. Is whatever solution the business wants can be co-developed with the intimate participation of the business, so that they're kind of not surprised at the end. They very much see a solution in which they've been a part of, given feedback, and actually very much socialized. And the change management is already done as part of the agile process, and that's quite an important thing to remember. Is because the customer is they see the product every progressing every 2 weeks. They're actually quite invested in the solution. Performance management, we talked about how work can be run as sprints, clearly defined starting points, clearly defined endpoints, with clear roles and responsibilities. Retrospectives, for example, can replace performance discussion. So this whole, it is a way of working and managing performance, which is much more customer focused and very efficient, but at the same time keeps all the employees engaged. Could even apply to industrial relations. Co-design of the workplace agreements, which is under negotiation, right? So instead of kind of the parties coming to the table on a certain date, maybe they could kind of work together to, and therefore you kind of get the objections, up front, rather than once the big stack of agreement has been put on the table. So I think I think that's where we'll end, and I think we'll kind of skip this realities. We talked about some of the realities, anyway. And there is the Scrum report will give you the challenges with implementing Scrum, and you can see that it's kind of organizational design, it's all culture, and letting legacy go. So I think this is kind of where we finish. I do have the last last layout in which we're asking you for feedback. So if you can, definitely, give your feedback, that will be very helpful. I do hope you've enjoyed. And like I said, Aaron and I could kind of probably speak about this for the next couple of hours. But we will spread it over the next webinar. So Aaron is going to be quite intimately involved with the community, Agile for HR. So definitely we look forward to seeing you there. And thanks for attending. Look, if you've got any questions, do let us know through emails. Do sign up for the next webinars, and the recording will be available in case if you want to revisit the webinar again. So thanks once again, Aaron. Thank you very much. It's been a really interesting discussion, and I'm sure we'll continue talking over a cup of coffee.
Definitely sounds